It has corrupted and deranged his whole being. His intellectual faculties are so impaired and debased that his understanding is quite incapable of discerning spiritual things in a spiritual manner. His heart, including the will, which is the practical principle of operation, is desperately wicked and in a state of blindness. Ephesians 4:18. The mind of fallen man is not only negatively ignorant, but positively opposed to light and convictions. To say that the natural man could please God if he would is false. His impotency is insurmountable to will good, for he lacks the nature or disposition to will well. Therefore, many men have greatly erred in supposing that the faculties of man are as capable now of receiving the testimony of God as they were before the fall. Unwillingness is not all which the Scriptures predicate of fallen man. They declare sin has so corrupted his being that he is rendered completely incapable of holy perceptions, and that it has utterly disabled him to perform spiritual acts. Ye have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt unto Pharaoh and unto all his servants, and unto all his land. The great temptations which thine eyes have seen, the signs, and those great miracles. Yet the Lord hath not given you a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear, unto this day. Deuteronomy 29, verses 2 to 4. The faculties were there, but they had not obtained power from God to perceive. And the Lord heard the voice of your words when ye spake unto me. And the Lord said unto me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken unto thee. They have well said all that they have spoken. Oh, that there were such a heart in them, that they would fear me, and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Deuteronomy 5:28 and 29. The faculties were there, but they lacked the spiritual power to use them. The unregenerate is utterly disabled by indwelling sin in all the faculties of his spirit and soul and body from thinking, feeling, or acting any spiritual good toward God. Yet the facts pointed out here do not to the slightest degree destroy or even lessen man's responsibility to glorify his Maker. This will the more fully appear as we now consider what man's inability actually consists of. First, it is a voluntary inability. It was so originally. Adam acted freely when he ate of the forbidden fruit, in consequence whereof he lost his native holiness and became in bondage to evil. Nor can his descendants justly murmur at their inheriting the depravity of their first parents and being made answerable for their inability to will or do good, as part of the forfeiture penalty due the first transgression, because their moral impotency consists of their own voluntary continuation of Adam's offense. The entire history of sin lies in inclination and self-determination. It must not be supposed for a moment that after the first sin of Adam, all self-determination ceased. William G. Shedd wrote, Original sin, as corruption of nature in each individual, is only the continuation of the first inclining away from God. The self-determination of the human will from God to the creature, as an ultimate end, did not stop short of with the act in Eden, but goes right onward to every individual of Adam's posterity until regeneration reverses it. As progressive sanctification is the continuation of that holy self-determination of the human will, which begins in its regeneration by the Holy Spirit, so the progressive depravation of the natural man is the continuation of that sinful self-determination of the human will which began in Adam's transgression. Unquote. Thus, the very origin and nature of man's inability unto good demonstrates that it cannot annul his responsibility. It was self-induced and is now self-perpetuated. So far from human depravity being a calamity for which we are to be pitied, it is a crime for which we are righteously to be blamed. So far from sin being a weakness or innocent infirmity arising from some defect of creation, it is a hostile power, a vicious enmity against God. The endowments of the creature placed him under lasting obligations to his Creator, and that obligation cannot be cancelled by any subsequent action of the creature. If man has deliberately destroyed his power, he has not destroyed his obligation. God does man no wrong in requiring from him what he cannot now perform, for by his own deliberate act of disobedience, man deprived himself and his posterity of that power, and his posterity consent to Adam's act of disobedience by deliberately choosing and following a similar course of wickedness. But how can man be said to act voluntarily when he is impelled unto evil by his own lusts? Because he freely chooses the evil. This calls for a closer definition of freedom or voluntariness of action. A free agent is one who is at liberty to act according to his own choice, without compulsion or restraint from without. And has not fallen man this liberty? Does he in any instance break God's law by compulsion against his inclinations? If it were true that the effect of human depravity be to destroy free agency and accountability, then it necessarily follows that the more depraved or vicious a man becomes, the less capable he is of sinning, and that the most depraved of all commit the least sin of any, which is too absurd to need refutation. Though on the one hand it is a fact that fallen man is the slave of sin and the captive of the devil, yet on the other it is equally true that he is still a voluntary and accountable agent. Man has not lost the essential power of choice, or he would cease to be man. Though in one sense he is impelled hellwards by the downward trend of his depravity, yet he elects to sin, himself consenting thereto. Though the rectitude of our will be lost, nevertheless we still act spontaneously. The soul of the wicked desireth evil, Proverbs 21:10, and for that he is to be blamed. If a man picked your pocket and when arrested said, "I could not help myself, I have a thievish disposition, I am obliged to act according to my nature," his judge would reply, "All the more reason you should be in prison." Because fallen man possesses the power of choice and is a rational creature, he is obligated to make a wise and good choice. The fault lies entirely at his own door that he does not do so, for he deliberately chooses the evil. They have chosen their own ways, and their soul delighteth in their abominations. I also will choose their delusions, and will bring their fears upon them, because when I called, none did answer. When I spake, they did not hear, but they did evil before mine eyes, and chose that in which I delighted not. Isaiah 66 verses 3 and 4. The bondage of the will to sinful inclinations neither destroys voluntariness nor our responsibility, for the enslaved will is still a self-determining faculty, and therefore under unescapable obligations to choose what man knows to be right. That very bondage is culpable, for it proceeds from self and not from God. Though man be the slave of sin, it is a voluntary servitude, and therefore it is inexcusable. The will is biased by the disposition of the heart. As the heart is, so the will acts. A holy will has a holy bias, and therefore is under a moral necessity of exerting holy volitions. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit. But a sinful will has a sinful bias because it has an evil disposition, and therefore is it under a moral necessity of exerting sinful volitions. But let it be pointed out once more that the evil disposition of man's will is not the effect of some original defect in the creature, for God made man upright. No, his very sinful disposition is the abiding self-determination of the human will. Its origin is due to the misuse Adam made of his freedom, and its continuation results from the unceasing self-determination of every one of his posterity. Each man perpetuates and prolongs the evil started by his first parents. Because man must act according to the state of his heart, does this destroy his freedom? Certainly not, for acting according to his heart is simply another way of saying that he does as he pleases. And doing as we please is the very thing in which all free agency consists. The pulse can beat and the limbs can act in bodily disorders, whether we will or no. We should, with good reason, consider ourselves hardly dealt with if we were blamed for such actions, nor does God hold us accountable for them. A good man's pulse may beat as irregularly in sickness as the worst villains in the world, or his hands may strike convulsively those who seek to hold him still. For such actions as these we are not accountable, because they have no moral value. No evil inclination of ours, or the lack of a good one, is necessary in order to them. They are independent of us. If all our actions were involuntary and out of our power, no ways necessarily connected with our disposition, our temper of mind, our choice, then we should not be accountable creatures or the subjects of moral government. If a good tree could bring forth evil fruit, and a corrupt tree good fruit, if a good man out of the good treasure of his heart could bring forth evil things, and an evil man out of his evil treasure good things, the tree could never be known by its fruits. In such case, all moral distinctions would be at an end. Moral government would cease to be, for men could no longer be dealt with according to their works, rewarded for the good and punished for the evil. The only man who is justly held accountable, rewardable, or punishable is one whose actions are properly his own, dictated by himself, and which could not take place without his consent. Here then is the answer to the objection that if fallen man is obliged to act according to the evil bias of his heart, he cannot rightly be termed a free agent, that necessity and choice are incompatible. Any inability to act otherwise than agreeably to our own minds would be an inability to act other than as free agents. But that necessity which arises from, or rather consists in, the temper and choice of the agent himself is the very opposite of acting against his nature and freedom. The sinner acts freely because he consents, even when irresistibly influenced by his evil lusts. Of Christ we read, "The Spirit driveth him into the wilderness," Mark 1:12, which indicates a forcible motion and powerful influence, yet of this same action of the Savior we are also told, "Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit in the wilderness," Matthew 4:1, which plainly signifies his freedom of action. So too, the Christian is both drawn and taught of God, John 6:44 and 45, liberty of his will, yet the victorious efficacy of divine grace are united together. Second, fallen man's inability is a moral and not a physical or constitutional one. Unless this be clearly perceived, we shall be inclined to turn our impotency into an excuse or ground of self-extenuation. Men will be ready to say, "Even though I possess the requisite faculties for the discharge of my duty, yet if I am powerless, then I cannot be blamed for not doing it." A person who is paralyzed possesses all the members of his body, but he lacks the physical power to use them, and no one condemns him for his helplessness. It needs then to be made plain that when the sinner is said to be morally and spiritually without strength, his case is entirely different from that of one who is paralyzed physically. The moral or ordinary natural man is not without either mental or physical strength to use his talents. What he lacks is a good heart, a disposition to love and serve God, a desire to please Him, and for that lack he is justly blamable. The mental and moral faculties with which man is endowed, despite their impaired condition, lay him under moral obligation to love and serve his Creator. The illustrious character and perfections of God make it unmistakably manifest that He is infinitely worthy of being loved and served, and therefore we are bound to love Him, which is what a good heart essentially consists of. There is no way of evading the plain teaching of Christ in the parable of the talents on this subject. "Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and at my coming I should have received mine own with usury." Matthew 25:27, which, in the light of the immediate context, clearly means that man ought to have had and heart to have improved to the best advantage, used aright, the talents which were committed to him. The inability of the natural man to meet the holy and just requirements of God consists in the opposition of his heart to Him, and this because of the presence and prevalency of a vicious and corrupt disposition. Men know that God does not require from them a selfish and wicked heart, and they also know that He has the right to require from them a good and obedient heart. To deny that God has the right to require a holy and good heart from fallen man would be tantamount to saying He had no right to require anything from them, and then it would follow that they were incapable of sinning against Him. For if God had no right to require anything from man, He would not be guilty of disobedience against Him. If God has no right to require a good heart from man, then He has no right to require him to do anything which he is unwilling to do, which would render him completely innocent. A child has no right to complain of a parent for requiring him to do what he has faculties to perform, but for which he has no heart. A servant has no right to complain of a master for reasonably requiring him to do what his endowments fit him to perform, but for which he is unwilling. A subject has no right to complain for a ruler requiring him to perform that which the good of his country demands, and which he is capacitated to render, merely because he lacks the disposition to do it. All human authority supposes a right to require that of men which they are qualified to perform, but have no heart unto. How much less reason, then, have those who are the subjects of divine authority to complain of being required to do what their faculties fit them for, but which their hearts hate? God has the same supreme right to command a cordial and universal obedience from Adam's posterity as he has from the holy angels of heaven. For the sake of quite a number of friends who have waited many years for further help on the problem raised by the relation of man's inability to his responsibility, we feel we must devote one more article to this difficult but important, perhaps to some, abstruse and dry aspect of our subject. Light thereon has only come to us, here a little and there a little, for we too are a very dull scholar. But the measure of understanding now vouchsafed us, it is our duty to share with others. We have sought to show that the problem we are now wrestling with appears much less formidable when once the precise nature of man's impotency be properly defined. It is due neither to the absence of requisite faculties for the performance of duty, nor to any force from without which compels him to act contrary to his nature and inclinations. Instead, his bondage unto sin is a voluntary one. He freely chooses the evil. Second, it is a moral inability and not physical or constitutional. In saying that the spiritual impotency of fallen man is a moral one, we mean that it consists of an evil heart, of enmity against God. He has no affection for his Maker, no will to please him, but instead an inveterate desire and determination to please himself and have his own way at all costs. It is therefore a complete misrepresentation of the facts of the case to picture fallen man as a being who wishes to serve God, but who is prevented from doing so by his depraved nature, that he genuinely endeavors to keep his law, but is hindered by indwelling sin. The fact is that he ever acts from his evil heart and not against it. Man is not well disposed toward his Creator, but ill disposed, no matter what change be wrought in his circumstances, be it from poverty to wealth, sickness to health, or vice versa. Man remains a rebel, perverse, stubborn, wicked, with no desire to be any better, hating the light and loving the darkness. It therefore follows that man's voluntary and moral inability to serve and glorify God is, third, a criminal one. As we have pointed out in previous articles, a wicked heart is a thing of an entirely different order from weak eyesight, a bad memory, or paralyzed limbs. No man is to blame for physical infirmities, providing they have not been self-induced by sinful conduct. But a wicked heart is a moral evil, yea, the sum of all evil, for it hates God and is opposed to our neighbors, instead of loving them as we are required. To say that the sinner cannot change or improve his heart is only to say he cannot help being a most vile and inexcusable wretch. To be unalterably in love with sin, so far from rendering it less sinful, makes it the more so. Surely it is self-evident that the more wicked a man's heart be, the more evil and blameworthy he is. The only other possible alternative would be to affirm that sin itself is not sinful. It is because the natural man loves sin and hates God that he has no inclination and will to keep his law. But so far from that excusing him, it constitutes the very essence of his guilt. We are told that Joseph's brethren hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Genesis 37:4. Why was it that they were unable to speak peaceably unto him? Not because they lacked vocal organs, but because they hated him so much. Was such inability excusable? No. In that consisted the greatness of their guilt. An apostle makes mention of men having eyes full of adultery and that cannot cease from sin. 2 Peter 2:14. But was not their impotency a culpable one? Surely it was, for the reason they could not cease from sin was that their eyes were full of adultery. So far from such an inability being an innocent one, it constituted the enormity of their crime. So far from excusing them, it made their sin the greater. Men must indeed be blind when they fail to see that it is their moral impotency, their voluntary enslavery to sin, which renders them obnoxious in the sight of the Holy One. A man's heart being fully set in him to do evil does not render his sinful actions the less criminal, but the more so. Consider the opposite. Does the strength of a virtuous disposition render of good action the less or the more praiseworthy? So far from God being less glorious because he is so infinitely and unchangeably holy in his nature that he cannot be tempted with evil, James 1:13, or act otherwise than in the most righteous and perfect manner. It constitutes the very excellency of the divine character. Is Satan any less sinful and criminal because he is of such a devilish disposition, so full of unreasonable malice against God and men, as to be incapable of anything but the most horrible wickedness? So of humanity. No one supposes the want or a will to work excuses a man from it, as physical incapacity does. No one imagines that the covetous miser, with his useless hoard of gold, but who has no heart to give a penny to the poor, is for that reason excused from deeds of charity as though he had nothing to give. How justly then may God still enforce his rights and demand loyal allegiance from men? God will not relinquish his claims because the creature has sinned, nor lower his requirements because he has ruined himself. Were God to command that which we ardently desired and truly endeavored to do, but for which we lacked the requisite faculties, we should not be to blame. But when he commands us to love him with all our hearts, and we refuse so to do, then we are most certainly to blame, notwithstanding our moral impotency, because we still possess the necessary faculties for the exercise of such love. This is precisely what sin consists of, the want of affections for God with the suitable expression in obedient acts, the presence of an inveterate enmity against him with its works of disobedience. Were God to grant rebels against his government the license to freely indulge their evil proclivities, that would be to abandon the platform of his holiness and to condone, if not endorse, their wickedness. William Cunningham declared, "There is no difficulty in seeing the reasons why God might address such commands to fallen and depraved men. The moral law is a transcript of God's moral perfections and must ever continue unchangeable. It must always be binding in all its extent upon all rational and responsible creatures, from the very condition of their existence, from their necessary relation to God. It constitutes the only accurate representation of the duty universally and at all times incumbent upon rational beings, the duty which God must of necessity impose upon and require of them. Man was able to obey this law, to discharge this whole duty in the condition in which he was created. If he is now in a different condition, one in which he is no longer able to discharge this duty, this does not remove or invalidate his obligation to perform it. It does not affect the reasonableness and propriety of God on the ground of his own perfections and of the relation in which he stands to his creatures, proclaiming and imposing this obligation, requiring of men to do what is still as much as ever incumbent upon them. Unquote. It has generally been lost sight of that the moral law is not only the rule of our works, but also of our strength. Inasmuch as well-being is the ground of well-doing, the tree must be good before the fruit can be. We are obliged to conclude that the law is the rule of our nature as truly as it is of our deeds. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Deuteronomy 6:5. And observe, that was said not only to unfallen Adam, but also to his fallen descendants, and that the Savior pressed the same. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength. Luke 10:27. The law not only requires us to love, but to have minds furnished with all strength to love God, so that there may be life and vigor in our love and obedience to Him. The law requires no more love than it does strength. Therefore, if it did not require strength to love, it would require no love either. Thus it is plain that not only does God enforce His rightful demands upon fallen man, but also that He has not abated one iota of His requirements because of the fall. If the divine law said nothing more unto the natural man today than, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with what strength thou now hast, rather than with the strength He requires him to have, and which He first gave unto him, so that both strength and faculty, love in its manifestation, came under the command, it would amount to, Thou needest not love the Lord thy God at all, for thou art now without strength, and therefore incapable of loving and serving Him, and art not to be blamed for having none. But as we have shown, man is culpable for his impotency, for the only reason why he loves not God is because his heart is still in enmity against Him. Did ever murderer plead at the bar of justice that he hated his victim so intensely that he could not go near him without killing him? If such were his acknowledgment, that only aggravated his crime, and he stands condemned out of his own mouth. Hell, then, must be the only final place for inalienable rebels against God. We should also call attention to the propriety of the divine law being pressed upon fallen men in all the length and breadth of its requirements, both as a means of knowledge and a means of conviction, even though it be no longer available as a standard which he is able to measure up to. in spite of his inability to render obedience to it, the law serves to inform man of the holy character of God, the relation in which he stands to him, and the duty which he still requires of him. So too, it serves as an essential means of convicting men of their depravity. Since they are sinners, it is most important that they should be made aware thereof. If their duty be made clear, if they be bidden to do that which is incumbent upon them, they are more likely to perceive how far short they come. If they are stirred up to endeavor a compliance with God's requirements, a discharge of their obligations, they will discover their moral helplessness in a way more forcible than any sermons can convey. In the next space, let us point out that fallen man is responsible to use means both for the avoidance of sin and the performance of holiness. Though the unregenerate be destitute of spiritual life, yet they are not therefore mere machines. The natural man has a rational faculty and a moral sense which distinguishes between right and wrong, and those faculties he is called upon to exert. So far from being under an inevitable necessity of living in known and gross sins, it is only because of deliberate perversity that any do so. The most profane swearer is able to refrain from his oaths when in the presence of someone whom he fears and to whom he knows it would be displeasing. Let a drunkard see poison put into his liquor, and it would stand by him untasted from morning till night. Criminals are deterred from many offenses by the sight of a policeman, though they have no fear of God before their eyes. Thus self-control is not utterly outside man's power. Enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass away. Proverbs 4:14 and 15. Is not the natural man capable of heeding such warnings? It is the bounden duty of the sinner to eschew everything which has a tendency to lead unto wrongdoing, to turn his back upon every approach unto evil and every custom which leads to wickedness. If we deliberately play with fire and are burned, the blame rests wholly on ourselves. There is still in the nature of fallen man some power to resist temptation, and the more it be asserted, the stronger it becomes. Otherwise, there would be no more sin in yielding to an evil solicitation than there is sin in a tree being blown down by a hurricane. Moreover, God does not deny grace to those who humbly and earnestly seek it from Him in His appointed ways. When men are influenced to passion, to allurements, to vice, they are blamable and must justly render an account unto God. No rational creature acts without some motive. The planets move as they are driven, and if a counter-influence supervene, they have no choice but to leave their course and follow it. But man has a power of resistance which they have not, and he may strengthen by indulgence or weaken by resistance the motives which induce him to commit wrong. How often we hear of athletes voluntarily submitting to the most rigorous discipline and self-denial. Does not that evince the natural man has power to refrain from self-indulgence when he is pleased to use it? Highly paid vocalists, abstaining from all forms of intemperance in order to keep themselves physically fit, illustrates the same principle. A heathen king took unto himself Sarah, but when God warned him that she was another man's wife, he touched her not. Observe carefully that the Lord said to him, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thine heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Genesis 20, verse 6. Abimelech had a natural integrity which God acknowledged to be in him, though he also affirmed his own power in restraining him. If men did but nourish their integrity, God would concur with them to preserve from many sins. Not only is man responsible to use means for the avoidance of evil, he is also under binding obligation to employ the appointed means for the furtherance of good. It is true that the efficacy of means lies in the sovereign power of God and not in the industry of man. Nevertheless, He has established a definite connection between means and the end desired. God has appointed that bodily life shall be sustained by bodily food, and if a man deliberately starves himself to death, he is guilty of self-destruction. Men still have power to attend upon the outward means, the principle of which are hearing the Word and engaging in prayer. They have the same feet to take them to church as conducts them to the theater, the same ability to pray unto God as the heathen have to cry unto idols. Slothfulness will be reproved in the day of judgment. Matthew 25:26. The sinner's plea that he had no heart for these duties will avail him nothing. He will have to answer for his contempt of God. Because he is a rational creature, man has the power to exercise consideration. He does so about many things. Why not about his soul? God Himself testifies to this power even in a sinful people. To His prophet He said, "Thou shalt remove thy place to another place in their sight. It may be they will consider, though they be a rebellious house." Ezekiel 12:3. Christ condemned men for their failure at this very point. "Ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky and of the earth, but how is it that ye do not discern this time? Yea, and why even of yourselves judge ye not what is right?" Luke 12:56 and 57. If men have the ability to take an inventory of their business, why not of their eternal concerns? Refusal to do so is criminal negligence. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn unto the Lord. Psalm 22:27. The natural man possesses the faculty of memory and is obligated to put it to the best use. Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. Lamentations 3:40. Failure so to do is a willful negligence. Man has not only physical organs but affections or passions. If Esau could weep for the loss of his blessing, why not for his sins? Observe the charge which God brought against Ephraim. They will not frame their doings to turn unto their God. Hosea 5:4. They would entertain no thoughts nor perform any actions that had the least prospect toward reformation. The unregenerate are capable of considering their ways. They know they shall not continue in this life forever, and most of them are persuaded in their conscience that after death there is an appointed judgment. True, the sinner cannot save himself, but he can obstruct his own mercies. Not only do men refuse to employ the means which God has appointed, but they scorn His helps by fighting against illumination and conviction.
This Reformation audio track is a production of Stillwater's Revival Books. SWRB makes thousands of classic Reformation resources available, free and for sale, in audio, video, and printed formats. Our many free resources, as well as our complete mail-order catalog, containing thousands of classic and contemporary Puritan and Reformed books, tapes, and videos at great discounts, is on the web at www.swrb.com. We can also be reached by email at swrb@swrb.com, by phone at 780-450-3730, by fax at 780-468-1096, or by mail at 4710-37A Avenue, Edmonton, that's Edmonton, Alberta, abbreviated capital A, capital B, Canada, T6L3T5. You may also request a free printed catalog. And remember that John Calvin, in defending the Reformation's regulative principle of worship, or what is sometimes called the scriptural law of worship, commenting on the words of God, which I commanded them not, neither came into my heart, from his commentary on Jeremiah 7:31, writes, God here cuts off from men every occasion for making evasions, since he condemns by this one phrase, I have not commanded them, whatever the Jews devised. There is then no other argument needed to condemn superstitions than that they are not commanded by God. For when men allow themselves to worship God according to their own fancies, and attend not to his commands, they pervert true religion. And if this principle was adopted by the Papists, all those fictitious modes of worship in which they absurdly exercise themselves would fall to the ground. It is indeed a horrible thing for the Papists to seek to discharge their duties towards God by performing their own superstitions. There is an immense number of them, as it is well known, and as it manifestly appears. Were they to admit this principle, that we cannot rightly worship God except by obeying his word, they would be delivered from their deep abyss of error. The prophet's words, then, are very important, when he says that God had commanded no such thing, and that it never came to his mind, as though he had said that men assume too much wisdom when they devise what he never required, nay, what he never knew.